Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to today's women's panel discussion. The topic of today's discussion has arisen from the recent remarks of His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmed, the worldwide head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. So let's begin by listening to these.
As I have said, the opponents of Islam continually allege that Islam denies women's equality. They claim to be the defenders of women's rights and that they wish to liberate women or grant them freedom. However, they are not sincere and their actions reveal the truth. In recent times, the whole world has seen how, under the guise of freedom, certain Western powers have waged wars in which countless defenseless women and girls have been killed or had their homes utterly decimated. Their schools, universities, and other centers of learning have been razed to the ground.
Very, very profound words, I'm sure you'll agree. So I wonder, when you heard the title of today's discussion, do Muslim women need saving by or from the West? What emotions did it evoke in you? I wonder what perspectives came to your mind. Was it war, the hijab, media, maybe the questions about identity and freedom? I wonder if you thought about the historical narratives here or the voices of Muslim women themselves. There's a lot here to unpack today. And at the heart of this discussion lies a deeper issue for us to think about, and that is the very meaning of freedom, the meaning of liberation. And when we think about saving, are we saving against whose standards? And it's even more pertinent in this day and age where the justification for international wars, one of the justifications being presented, are the rights of women. And these wars are claiming thousands of lives. So, to explore these issues in greater depth, I'm joined by a very distinguished and, might I say now, international panel. Immediately beside me, I have Khola Hübsch. Khola joins us from Germany. She is a journalist who has written and spoken widely on Islam. The German broadcaster ARD has designated her as the public face of Muslim women in Germany. Welcome, Khola. Besides her, we have Ayesha Malik. Ayesha is a writer, legal scholar, and the editor of the Law and Human Rights section for the Review of Religions magazine, and is a graduate of Harvard Law School. Welcome, Ayesha. And joining us online from Sweden, we have Professor Yafa Shanneik. Professor is a professor of Islam and Society at SOAS University of London. Her research explores the intersections of Islam, gender, and migration in Europe and the Middle East, with a focus on transnational Muslim women's resistance and how they challenge social and political power structures. Welcome, Professor. So I think let's start straight at the deep end, and I'll start with yourself, Professor. Do Muslim women need saving?
Well, first of all, Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Thanks very much for having me. Do Muslim women need saving? I think the question is rather, have Western power ever done anything meaningful to rescue and save women at all? Or have they done more harm than good? So let me take you back in history. At the turn of the last century, Lord Cromer governed Egypt for the British Empire. And he called Islam's fatal obstacle to civilization. A feminist hero, he was celebrated. Well, not really, because he was liberating Muslim women in Cairo while denying the vote of English women back home at the same time. And the problem is that history keeps repeating itself. It never ended here. So look at France, for example. The French staged unveiling ceremonies in Algeria as war propaganda. After 9/11, the burqa was used as a reason to bomb Afghanistan, a fight for women's dignity, they called it. Has it changed anything? Nothing. So my question is here, saving women from what? Saving by whom? And most importantly, saving to what as well? Because saving is never neutral. It always assumes there is someone here who is in distress and someone there who is in a better position to be holding the lifeboat. Spivak describes it as the fantasy of white men saving brown women from brown men. The women in the middle here never actually get to speak or to be heard, listened to. Women are usually the object of everyone's concern, but hardly ever spoken to and listened to. So, yeah, my honest answer here is Muslim women do not need saving. They need rather someone to ask them so that they can speak up and be trusted that they know their lives best and they can find their own solutions for their problem. Yeah, I will stop.
Thank you, Professor. Very, very interesting words there. And I think I'll go to you, Ayesha, next. And would you agree with the Professor's remarks?
Yes, thank you, Professor Shanneik. I think I do agree as a Muslim woman, as a visibly Muslim woman living in the West. I think we've all faced a time when we want to explore the idea of freedom and liberty, what it means to us. And before we get to whether we need saving, I think we're all visibly Muslim women in this room, and when the issue of the hijab comes up, which is very often and volatile, I often say that the loudest voices in the hijab debate are often those of men. Men have the loudest say in women's sartorial choices. And I think taking this more broadly, we've seen a new form of laïcité, as the French are calling it, a new form of liberalism that is taking hold. And we're calling it a radical form of secularism where a certain kind of perspective on freedom, a certain kind of idea is being entrenched. And you even see this in the European Court of Human Rights, the jurisprudence that's coming out from the court. There's a lot of study now and awareness about it. And one scholar has written fairly deeply about it, that the religious symbolism now that's taking hold and how the court is studying this jurisprudence, particularly the Muslim hijab, it's being singled out for special treatment. So she actually makes a very profound argument that sums up the predicament of Muslim women in the West, which is that the court is readily able to accept that women, they will concede that Muslim women need freedom from religion, not freedom of religion, to be declared free. And I think that sort of sums up where we are, where we have a very specific narrative going down in the media. We have very little grassroots conversations like these. We have very little grassroots interactions. So where you and I live, at least where I live, is a quiet English village, mostly filled with English people. They've never met a Muslim woman before. Perhaps they've never gone into a Muslim home before. So everything they are understanding or gauging is from reading quick bursts of information off a tablet. They read a headline, they're probably not even going down scrolling further. So I think we're having this polarization and very little awareness around people actually thinking that they're just forming perspectives based on algorithms. So when you look at it from a Muslim woman's point of view, we think we have a lot of saviors around us. A lot of people want to save us, but I think the Muslim woman's voice, if you try and talk to media outlets, they don't want to come and report Jalsa, for example, because there's nothing fun to report. We've actually had journalists tell us that. But here are 19, 20,000 Muslim women from all backgrounds, all different kind of wearing different stripes. Doctors, lawyers, journalists, architects, engineers. They're getting their hands dirty. They're doing what men do. And yesterday I was talking to a journalist in The Independent, and I said that this separation from men is not from a point of weakness. It denotes strength because men and women are considered separate, and that's where the notion of saving comes from. That, oh my goodness, Muslim women are oppressed. I can't see their hair, so definitely they may have lost their voice as well. They may have lost their brains inside their headscarves. So we really need to rescue them from that. But actually, the key is that we are not separated from men. We are separate and distinct from them, and we have our own unique individuality. And that voice needs to ripple further. And I think the media is a big hurdle until we live in the global village, but not really. But until we can actually live in a virtual global village without prejudice, I think this image and this narrative will continue to persist.
It's a really interesting point you make, Ayesha, and particularly with that kind of hollow that we have. And I think just today, in the address of the head of the worldwide Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, he encouraged us to gain knowledge and to spread that knowledge, to show people what true Islam is and what it means to us as women, and to try and fill that hollow almost. But you've raised an interesting and commonly critiqued gender issues, so let's carry on with that theme. And Khola, if I can come to you, do you think there are double standards in how Western societies critique gender issues in Muslim communities versus their own?
Yeah, definitely there are. It's obvious, I think. The example you just gave, it's a beautiful example for that. Because just recently, I think 2 weeks ago, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, you perhaps know it, it's the most nationwide common newspaper in Israel, they reported about a town nearby Tel Aviv, Break Brak. It's a town where rabbis now ordered a gender separation on the streets. So when you want, the main streets, there are like separate lanes for women and for men. So it's a clearly, gender separation. And the discussion in Germany would be like, nobody would comment on that, because many Islam critics, there are Israel loyal to Israel, and they would never criticize such kind of ultra-Orthodox traditions, and they would not problematize it. But if it comes to the separation we have, for example, at Jalsa Salana, then the same Islam critics, they talk about gender apartheid. They use this strong vocabulary and rhetoric. And they would never talk about apartheid, the political apartheid, which is a real existing, really internationally criticized problem. But they would talk about gender apartheid only in the context of Muslims practicing it, for example, at mosques and so on. And in Israel, it's even, it's stricter. It's not only the streets, it's the schools, it's the synagogues. It's just a common practice. So there are double standards if it's a Jewish tradition or if it's Muslims are doing the same thing. And these double standards you can see in many fields. But just to refer to what the professor just said, I think there is a pattern. And the pattern is historically, it's in the post-colonial studies, it's well documented. The pattern is, she mentioned Lord Cromer. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the story of Lord Cromer. He was a British colonial administrator, and he tried to enforce, the hijab, which was worn by Egyptian women, he forced them to take it off in the name of liberation, of course. And the same Lord Cromer, he was in Britain, He was the founder member of Men's League against women's suffrage, against women's right to vote. He was campaigning. It was the early 20th century, and he was campaigning against it. So it's a very familiar term. Laila Ahmed, the post-colonial academic, she talks about colonial feminism. And the point is that feminism is used to masquerade and to cover up geopolitical and intentions which are connected with power, geopolitical interest. You cannot say, we want to have the oil, we want to have the resources of the other country. You cannot say that openly. So you need a moral validation. And this moral validation is through, we want to liberate the women. We are for human rights, and we want to spread democracy. And that is only a false propaganda. It's a story which is told by states who uses this kind of storytelling to convince the international states and people that they agree that what they are doing is aggression wars, which are conflicting with international law and which are violating international law. It's illegal invasion in Iran, in Iraq 2003, or now in Iran. It's everything, getting more and more obvious that it's not about women's rights or women's autonomy, or it had nothing to do with human rights as well. It's just about geopolitical interest and being, a colonial power who can exploit their own status and their power and their privilege.
Thank you. It's really interesting because you mentioned Western feminism, and I wonder, Professor, if I can come to you about this. Do you think that Western feminism has space for Muslim women, or does it often demand them to abandon their faith to be considered liberated?
Yeah, well, I think that first of all, we shouldn't be drawing boundaries. The us and them narrative, I think, should be problematized a little bit, because I think we have been borrowing from one another, learning and constructing a different view, through looking at different voices. So I think that one could learn from Western feminism, but the thing is, with all these concepts, they have developed out of a specific context where you cannot just copy and paste it into another context without making it relevant. And one should also take into consideration that Muslim women have their own agentic narrative of how to go back to sources, reinterpret different texts. So we also have Islamic feminism that does great work for allowing women to carve their own places within their own societies and communities. I actually would like to go back to the double standard question that you raised before, because for 20 years, the suffering of Afghan women under the veil was front page news everywhere, and as I said, it also served as a tool or a reason to go and invade Afghanistan. And during the genocide on Gaza, the United Nations documented Palestinian women having cesareans with no anesthesia because anesthetics had been blocked. And the same cause of concern was strangely quiet. Nobody talked about it. So, on the one hand, concerned about Muslim women's rights and human rights more generally, but when it came to Palestinian women's rights, everyone was silent. So I came to believe that the question is not really how much these women are suffering, but rather, is their suffering useful to us? When it suits the narrative, it becomes headline. When it doesn't, it's silenced.
A really interesting point, and I think I'd like to actually share a quote with you. And that quote is, "The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. You might think that this quote is from recent times, but actually, maybe perhaps you're thinking about the US-Iran war, but actually this is from 2001. This was by Laura Bush, just after President George Bush declared a war on terror. Now, kind of with the benefit of hindsight, we really do need to question this historical pattern that we've seen, and that professor was referring to as well, of women's rights being used as one of the justifications for military invasions. So, Khola, if I can start with you, why is it then that some Western governments and commentators position themselves as defenders of Muslim women's rights?
I think it's a useful and needed narrative. It's in their advantage, because we have to ask ourselves the question: what is the function of it, and why is it that Islamophobia and these narratives are so on peak in times where we have wars? It was during 2001, you mentioned, the post 9/11 wars, and then 2003, we had many wars against the whole Middle Eastern region. It was a destabilization of the whole region, and now it's again Iran, the war. So every time Western countries are waging wars, aggression wars, violating international laws, they need something, to legitimize these wars and to cover up what their pure interests are, because they cannot talk about them openly because it would be morally not okay. So that is something you can notice that every time we have these wars, Islamophobia is on rise. There's this debate on migration, and the Muslim lives are dehumanized. So you only can do a genocide if you if you're able to convince the parties who are waging the wars that your enemy is not a real human. It is really a need of dehumanizing your enemy, saying they are Muslims, they are backward, they are not, they're treating their women in a bad way. We have to bring to them civilization or whatsoever. So that's a really important story, a propaganda story. And usually people think only authoritarian regimes are doing propaganda, but democratic regimes or democratic states are doing propaganda as well when they are in wars. There's this famous saying, the first victim of a war is truth. So whenever you want to fight a war, and usually wars are, the reasons, it's obvious, it's because of resources, geopolitical interests, it's because of power, but you cannot claim that. So you have to tell a story. And I think this kind of propaganda is using its effects, because we are now, Gen Z is, you mentioned the algorithms, we are well informed in one way, and then there's a disinformation on the other side. But I'm not sure if the propaganda, which worked quite well 2001, is still working in 2026. More and more people are starting to realize, it's getting obvious. It's not about human rights. It's not about democracy. It's not about women's rights. So in Venezuela, Trump openly said, we just want the oil. So there is a shift, there is a shift also in the communication, in the style of rhetoric, of using propaganda, because it's getting so obvious that the reasons are just profane reasons and not something noble. So I think that's the function of it.
Yeah, and Ayesha, do you think that, such military invasions or foreign policies where women's rights have been masqueraded as justification, have they actually improved the lives of women?
I think the patterns speak for themselves. I think Afghanistan is an interesting case because we all know what Kabul was like in the 60s, right? It was called the Paris of the Middle East or Asia. And I think there's a sense where we're here living in this part of the world, we hold ourselves to very high standards. We sort of say we are the flag bearers of human rights. We need to protect everyone. We speak about equality. But we don't speak enough about equity. And I think when we hold ourselves here to supposedly high standards, those high standards should apply across the board. When you are dealing internationally, and it's what Khola summed up really well. And I remember a particularly paradoxical time in the news cycle about 10 years ago in January 2016, where there were two parallel headlines. One was that Saudi Arabia was going to execute about 40 people on death row, and at the same time, David Cameron was putting Saudi Arabia on the Human Rights Council. And you know, it's about political agendas over superseding those high standards that we talk about, living in these democratic nations where we do enjoy a lot of freedoms. And I speak as a woman who grew up in Pakistan. I was living in Pakistan when 9/11 happened, and I personally saw and experienced a shift change in the global narrative because I was at the receiving end of the news cycle, living there, and I think that that was a turning point, a watershed moment for identity rights, and as a visible Muslim woman, I think that really marked a changing point. But on the other side of the border, women were already in not a great place. And I think it's important to unpack, Maleeha, a little bit why nations, and there's a historical pattern of nations in the developing world being put in debt, for example, being constantly having to rely on financial aid. There is almost a silent movement where the developing world is deliberately unable to thrive and made to persist in that cycle. Therefore, they have to rely on the West. Therefore, it becomes, and they are compelled to be saved. So it's almost like this a vicious circle that repeats itself. And Rwanda in Africa is a very good example because I personally went out there to do a week of service, and because Rwanda isolated itself and didn't bow to international pressure, they present a very unique example that we can follow where they can really, they're working on their country and their freedoms, and their women are doing amazing things, free from the pressure of having to rely on international or external help.
That's really interesting. And I think if we do think about Muslim nations themselves, Professor, if I can ask you, how do we reconcile that unfortunately some Muslim nations do oppress women and force the hijab? Does that prove that Islam is misogynistic? And, you know, is Islam inherently at odds with women's rights, or is that a misinterpretation?
Well, you know, don't get me wrong, there are Muslim women, as there are other women everywhere in the world, who live under real injustices. So, yeah, of course, you know, injustices, they do exist, and they deserve to, you know, to receive solidarity, resources, and outrage. But the starting point of our conversation today was whether, you know, they need saving. And I think that this is a very, you know, strange way to describe it, because it turns these women who have a life, a mind, and also are actively, clearly analyzing their situation and trying to find ways and solutions out of their injustices. They are, you know, seen as passive, just sitting there waiting to be rescued. But this is not what is happening on the ground. You very often find women who are already actively organizing themselves in, you know, to find solutions, to reinterpret sources, to revisit history, to look at historical, you know, Islamic figures who they can take as examples for how, you know, Islam actually tried to support women. And that's the situation nowadays. If you do find them, they are related to societal issues that need to be taken care of. But the point here is that this change needs to occur from within. Women themselves, within their communities and societies, need to find solutions for their injustices, and it is happening. That is the point. That it is something. I mean, we look at various examples in terms of voting rights, of birth control, participation in public spaces. You do see societies evolving and changing, and women gaining more rights, every day, and or fighting at to gain more rights. So the change is already happening, and it is happening from within, and there is no need for having external powers coming in to make changes that they're not doing. And one point that is also very important, I think, to mention here is this should not happen through violence. So, and what history has shown us, all these apparent changes that Western powers are trying to do to help women, we're all and are still through military invasions, through violence, and this is not the way forward. There should be obviously dialogue, and there has always been dialogue, translations, and cooperations. As we heard the speaker before mentioning, equity. Yes, we need to together, we need to collaborate, to find solutions. But the problem with using terms like saviors, it already puts the power dynamics in very imbalanced form. And this is not the way forward. One needs to have a platform where everyone is equal, looking for solutions for problems. And the best to find solutions are the people who are inside them, who are from within. And this is happening, and obviously there's more to do and more to change and more to improve. But this is something that we all need to work together to secure and so forth.
Thank you, Professor. I think that's a wonderful note to end, I think, our conversation. But if we have time, maybe we can take some questions from the floor. So if I can start with yourself on my right.
I wanted you talked about double standards, but I wanted you to address the double standards when it comes to gender-based sexual domestic violence in the West. Those issues are always called out in Muslim societies, but as if to ignore that that's a very real problem in the West, and that seems to be something that's ignored, I guess. So I'd love for you guys to talk about that.
Ayesha, would you like to?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and it's one that I bring up often when we're talking about this. That there is a serious domestic issue, and other things where women are vulnerable in confined spaces. I think that narrative doesn't see the light of day very often, or nearly as often, as much as Muslim women abroad. And I think this does camouflage the need to what we say, dealing with each other in equity, that women here versus women there. Women, I think, share an identity. We have similar needs. We have similar, I think, vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities exist anywhere where we feel pressured or spoken for or marginalized in any way. I think politically we have an issue with women's rights being weaponized politically. And I think the domestic violence problem is one example. The example of Muslim women being oppressed abroad is another. I think there's very little discussion around women like Fatima al-Fahiri, who founded the first university, for example. And I think probably a lot of people don't know that the first women university was founded by Fatima al-Fahiri. So I think there is, yes, we need to remember that Muslims are unique individuals everywhere.
I would just like to add an example for double standards or in another field. You probably have, it's a current example, Anne Hathaway, the actress of The Devil Wears Prada. She was seen in France, you know, wearing a full cover-up suit to going for swim. And everyone said, oh, it's so very demure, very mindful. She's protecting herself from UV, so health conscious, and she's like avant-garde. And everyone was praising her style, you know, with full cover-up. She wore a hat and sunglasses and, you know, a full bodysuit. And later, many content creators on social media that it's just hypocrisy, you know. In France it's the same country where 2016 there was this picture of Nice, you know, where women wearing the bikini, she was forced to remove her top, you know, just because it's considered as being extreme or it's associated with oppression. So the same coverings, the same kind of clothing is one very demure, very mindful, very avant-garde and fashionable and whatever. And on the other side, it's oppression and extremism. So you can see it's just about how you frame things. It's just framing, it's propaganda. It's not about the thing or an objective analyze, you know, but it's how you try to sell a story and convince people to think a certain kind of thing. Yeah, it's not about truth.
That's great. Thank you so much. Should we take some more questions? Yes, would you like to?
Hello. So my question is, if you see in the pre-Islam era, or Islamic Golden Age, it was kind of the how I say, the Middle Eastern countries were kind of flourishing. And for example, if I mention the example of the first wife of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she was a businesswoman, or they were ladies who were teaching Islamic teachings and many other things which were in the European countries not even thinkable, like they were not existing these kind of rights. So do you think that maybe this kind of change, for example, that now in the Western country the situation became better and now in the Middle Eastern country the situation changed, or what do you think?
Professor, are you able to hear the questions? If so, I wondered if you'd like to take that one.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you very much for bringing up the wife of the Prophet and other historical female figures that young Muslims like you take them as role models and examples of how women's roles in society should actually be, and they're using this is exactly how Islamic feminists are dealing with the situation, because they're using historical figures as examples to counter some contemporary understandings of limiting women's rights within specific Muslim contexts. So are there changes? The thing is, if you look at the spread of Islam and particularly women converting to Islam in Europe, this is increasing, and it's increasing rapidly as well. And it's really interesting to analyze this and focus on it a little bit more, because there is something in Islamic teachings that a lot of young people particularly are seeing very useful for them, and one of them is, for example, the issue around liberty, right? The right to choose. And thank you very much for bringing up the example of France, because I think this is a really good one here. Forcing a woman out of the veil, is very similar to forcing her into one. It's the same. However, the difference is that one of them is called liberation. But the point is about choice. A choice that's only allowed when she chooses what you would choose isn't real choice, right? And I think this whole understanding of right, liberty, freedom, is very much questioned in Europe these days. And I think the last 2.5 years have intensified it, because a lot of young people are very disappointed of how things have been dealt with in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and they do think that the global south is bringing much more to the table than actually Europe used to.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And I think you raised a really important point about autonomy. And I know within medicine, we are very firm on the principle of autonomy. And so if a patient is making a choice that may be counter to what I feel is wise, provided they have the capacity to do so, then I have to respect that decision, because that is what true autonomy is about. So thank you so much. And I wonder if there's any more questions. Maybe we'll do one more before we finish. Does this little boy have a question? Yes, of course.
Little boy, how can I make sure that my mum and my sister get their rights?
Go on, Aisha.
Thank you. I think you're already on a very good path, because you as a boy are asking that question. And I think there are not enough boys asking those questions. And if every young boy starts asking that question and fulfilling their role, which is to be protective and fair, I think women will automatically get their rights, because the rights exist. They exist in the Quran. We've spoken about Hazrat Ayesha, and there are scores of Muslim women in history who are real examples. If you go and look them up, you'll find that they were fighting battles. They were doing amazing things. They were pioneers in mathematics. They were building universities. But just as behind every strong man, there is a woman. I don't know if you heard that. But behind every successful man, there is a woman. Similarly, behind every strong woman, there is a supportive man. Because Allah says if one is the heart, the other one is the mind. They're two different things, but they work together. And that's how you can breathe and think, right? So if you keep asking good questions, then your mother and your sister and your wife and your daughters, inshallah, will get their rights.
Jazakallah. And I think that would be a wonderful note to end on today. Thank you to our very distinguished panel. Thank you to all of our guests. I think ultimately for me and for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Muslim women, we're not waiting to be saved. Our liberation was established at the very inception of Islam by God Almighty Himself. Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.